Hello, my name is Sara Marie Massee, and I am the manager of historic trades at George Washington's Mount Vernon. I'm here to talk about seasonal eating at Mount Vernon. Nowadays, seasonal eating is trendy. It's something that you see at very foodie restaurants. They'll highlight their seasonal dishes, or you'll see it on a blog here or there. But the reality is that for most of us, seasonality is becoming harder and harder to distinguish because, when we go to the grocery store and we can get strawberries, for example, year round, that's been the case my entire life. But strawberries are really only ripe here on the East Coast in spring and early summer. And nowadays, even some of the holdouts that in my childhood were still seasonal, things like cherries, you're starting to see them year round. I saw, it's January right now. I saw fresh cherries in the grocery store just about a week ago. So, in the 18th century, seasonal eating was not trendy. It was a fact. It was a reality of life, not a choice. And so I want to talk a little bit about how that would affect the different groups of people living here at Mount Vernon. I'll focus on the Washington family as well as the enslaved community. And this is a 4-part series. And today, this is part 1. We're focusing on winter, so December, January, and February. So the topics that I will be covering today, we're going to start by looking at kind of how was winter as a season? Was it a hungry season? And then what types of crops, what foods are available that time of year? We will examine an 18th century menu. We will talk about special holiday foods. Winter is the time that Christmas comes around. And we'll talk about the enslaved community's diet in the winter. So I want to start by thinking about, was winter a hungry time of year? We tend to think of it as a lean time, and a lot of representations in books and movies show it that way. But I would actually argue that, especially in early winter, it was a time of relative plenty. And that is because you had all of these stores, these winter stores that you had been gathering throughout the other seasons, and they were chock full. And there were a number of vegetables that were still being harvested in the winter as well. So what was growing in the winter? And how do we know what was growing? You'll see this image on the left. That is actually, it comes from an 18th century cookbook by Elizabeth Raffald. She published The Experienced English Housekeeper in 1769. And it lists, what vegetables were available, what meat, what fish, and it has these lists and lists for every single month of the year of what might be available. Other cookbooks also address this as well. So in the winter, typically what you had available were root vegetables, things like beets, carrots, potatoes, sweet potatoes. You had coleworts, and that is the 18th century term for what we would call cole crops or brassicas. They're basically things in the cabbage family. So, cabbages, Brussels sprouts, kale, collards, those kinds of greens. Salad greens, surprisingly enough, and those would have been available mostly by using hotbeds and cold frames. Herbs, some of them survive better than other in winter, so that would kind of depend. And obviously dried would be available. Pumpkins and winter squash. Now, that one is an interesting one because pumpkins were not available in Europe. This is a New World crop, an American crop. It's something that the indigenous people would have introduced to the colonists. And we know that Washington grew not huge amounts, but multiple acres of pumpkins. And he grew them both as a fodder crop for livestock and as a crop for people to eat. Hothouse vegetables would be available in winter. and then winter fruits. And, there we're talking about apples and pears. We're talking about nuts. But there are also a couple of more unusual heirloom fruits that you might not be familiar with. So, for example, medlars. I believe that Washington was consuming medlars, though I would need to check on whether he was importing them or actually growing them here. They are one of they grow on a fruit tree. They're one of the fruits that are harvested latest in the year, December, and they need what's called a bledding period, Bletting. And what that means is you pick them when they're perfectly ripe, and then you actually have to let them sit and almost start to rot. They're not really bad, but they don't taste good until they've had this bledding period. Persimmons are another winter fruit that would be available. And then, of course, you would have preserved foods. So winter was a time when you were relying on these preserved foods. Some of them are obvious, dried beans, dried fruits. There are many recipes in 18th century cookbooks for things like peach chips, right? Things could be stored in the root cellar. And I chose the picture of these poached pears here. We don't tend to think of pears as something going in a root cellar, but actually they often would. Now, they wouldn't just be piled up like the potatoes would. Pears and apples and other fruits were often stored in straw. Straw allows the ester gases that the fruit releases to escape. So because otherwise, if you guys probably know the old wives tale about like putting your fruit into a paper bag to ripen faster, right? Well, that's because the fruit releases these ester gases, which then cause the other fruit to ripen. So storing these things in the root cellar, which was a controlled temperature environment, but in straw, would keep them separated from one another so that if they spoiled, if one got a bad spot, it wouldn't transfer to the other fruit. And then also it released these ester gases so that you didn't have ripening happening too fast. Other methods of preservation, pickling. Pickling was much bigger in the 18th century than it is today. They pickled all kinds of things, things that we typically don't. Carrots, cauliflower, mushrooms were often pickled. Sweet preserves were another method of preservation, and that includes things like candied orange and lemon peel, candied citron, but also jellies and jams. Fermentation is another method of preservation that was being used at the time. So you don't see a ton of sauerkraut or fermented vegetables in English cookery of the 18th century. And of course, English cookery is what Washington would have been used to consuming. But you do see dairy products that were fermented here at Mount Vernon. Potting is a preservation technique used for meats. And the idea here is that you cook, salt, and spice the meat. Salt and spices both have preservation qualities on their own, and then you pack the meat into some kind of metal or earthenware container, and you pour either melted lard or melted butter on top, and that creates an airtight seal that keeps the meat from spoiling. And meats could actually last quite a few months that way, especially in the cold weather that came in the winter. And then salting and brining, again, primarily for meats, but also for eggs, for butter, even sometimes for beans. I've seen 18th century recipes for kidney beans that are salted to preserve them. So those are some of the types of preservation methods and some of the types of foods that they would have. Another aspect of winter seasonality that I wanted to talk about is animal products. We don't think of animal products as being seasonal today because we can get them any time of year that we want. But the reality is that animals are affected by the seasonal cycle the same way that humans are. Later in the series, we will be looking at a bill of fare from an 18th century cookbook, and some of those winter bills of fares call for potted lobster. Well, that's because lobster has this dormant season during the winter. You can catch some, but it's hard to get fresh lobster that time of year. Veal and lamb are often listed as being available yearly, all year long, but of course, they're going to be bigger and less tender in the winter because typically your calves and your lambs are born in spring. Winter was also the season of hog slaughtering. We have quite a few records in the farm reports and Washington's diaries of hog slaughtering happening in the winter. It started in fall, so typically around October, but it went through December and sometimes even early January. And then the availability of eggs and dairy would also be reduced during the winter season. Chickens are affected by daylight. A lot of modern egg producing facilities today actually have UV lamps in the facilities where they raise their chickens. So it kind of tricks the chickens into laying year round. But in a natural setting where they didn't have those artificial lights available, chickens will lay fewer eggs come winter. And so the preserved eggs that I talked about, the salted eggs, those were usable for cooking. They weren't so good if you wanted to have, an omelet or some kind of egg focused dish. So that's something that would affect how you could eat in the winter as well. And milk production would be affected in the winter also. We know that milk production would go down slightly in the winter. The nutrition of your milk would change in the winter as well, which might affect the texture and the mouthfeel of milk. The cows this time of year would not have fresh grass available. They would be relying on hay and possibly grain, and it just wasn't as nutritious. So I'd like to look at how that plays out in an 18th century cookbook. This is a bill of fare for January, and this is from Richard Briggs, The English Art of Cookery, published in 1771. And you'll notice, first of all, that most of the dishes in an 18th century meal were heavily meat and fish based. You don't actually see a lot of focus on vegetables. But a lot of what I was talking about in terms of the things that were available plays out in this list of what kinds of things to eat. So you're not seeing a lot of fresh. You're definitely not seeing like peaches or things like that. What you do see in terms of vegetables, there's salad. And remember, I said that salad greens would be available, grown in hotbeds or cold frames. There's dressed greens. Greens, many of them can actually be harvested year round. There's spinach, also grown in hotbeds or cold frames, broccoli. You do see mushrooms. Most likely those would be pickled or dried and reconstituted. You see asparagus, that also probably would rely on cold frames. So these are some of the kinds of things available. Artichoke bottoms, those are another vegetable-based dish that you're seeing here. Those would be pickled. And actually, Martha Washington's favorite vegetable apparently was artichokes. So how would the enslaved community's diet be affected in the winter? Their diet would be much less extensive than the Washingtons. I talked about how, especially early winter was a season of relative plenty. That was still true for the enslaved community, but it was less true certainly than the Washingtons. So what you're seeing here is a picture of winter cabbages. And you'll notice that, they're around, but you can harvest them, but they're not as plentiful. And they wouldn't have had access to a lot of the methods that the Washingtons used to keep crops alive during the winter. So for them, they're really mostly having the root vegetables and the coleworts, and then anything dried or preserved. So that's what they would have available. I also wanted to talk about some of the work that they were doing, because a lot of what they were doing in the winter was geared towards having foods available later in the year. So, you'll see the wheat here. Threshing was an activity that was going on quite a bit at the farms during the winter season. That's borne out in the farm reports. There's also a ton of infrastructure work that's going on this time of year. Repairs, building new buildings, digging ditches, creating roads. Those are the kinds of tasks that the enslaved community would have been doing. And these are all tasks that are geared towards, creating crops in the future. Another task that shows up a lot in these farm reports for the winter is, clearing land and they call it drudging it out, but it's basically, like getting the roots and the rocks out so that the field would be workable later on. So I also wanted to talk a little bit about Christmas foods this time of year. Obviously, winter is a time when people were eating a lot of special things. So for the Washingtons, they would have access to all kinds of amazing treats. This is a picture of cherry bounce. Cherries would be pressed, they would press the juice. Sugar is a preservative. It kills bacteria and keeps mold from growing in certain instances. And so, sweetened cherry juice or cherry cordials would have been available. And then this is an alcoholic drink. So you would add a bit of rum or other alcohol. One of the most important Christmas treats for the Washington family would be Christmas pie. And this was a Yorkshire Christmas pie. It's a style of meat pie, and it was designed to be a showstopper, as you can see in that central picture. Some of them got really big, over 100 pounds. The biggest one on record was over 100 pounds. And these would be, people would have them shipped to friends and neighbors. The recipe in Hannah Glass, which is one of the most popular cookbooks in colonial America, a book that we know the Washingtons had. So the recipe for Christmas pie in that book calls for a pigeon. I hope I remember all of these. Okay, so it's a pigeon inside of a partridge, inside of a chicken, inside of a goose, inside of a turkey. Hopefully I remembered all of those. And you can see the different layers in the image on the left. But there's this wonderful series of letters between Washington and his army buddy, Colonel Humphreys. They're talking about the attack on the Christmas pies. And so we know that Christmas pie was something that was enjoyed here at Mount Vernon. Another highlight of the Christmas season would have been desserts. On the left, you're seeing a hedgehog. This is a cake, and Hannah Glass has a recipe for hedgehog as well. On the right, you're seeing grape cake, and we actually have a surviving recipe recorded by the Washington's granddaughter, Nellie Custis, of Martha's version of grape cake. And grape cake was traditionally served throughout the Christmas season, the 12 days of Christmas, but especially on 12th night. And sometimes you would have, like a coin or something baked into it, and whoever got the coin would be crowned king or queen for the day. So it's a little bit like the king cake tradition. Did the enslaved people have Christmas food traditions? We're not entirely sure. There were some special foods that were available to them this time of year. We do know that this was hog slaughtering season. I mentioned that before. And so, It was traditional for the Washingtons to provide a lot of the offal, meaning the undesirable cuts of meat, the organ meats, to the enslaved. So things like chitlins and other organ meats would have been a special treat this time of year. Cracklings, which are basically the little bits of meat left over after you have rendered the fat of a pig into lard. So certainly, Christmas is a time of year, like one of the only times of year that the enslaved were probably able to eat until they were completely full. So that was certainly special. And then persimmons that were another Christmas food that we don't know if they actually associated it with Christmas, but persimmons are a fruit that was harvested after the first frost, and often they continue to be good and harvestable through Christmas time. And we know that the enslaved people here at Mount Vernon were making persimmon beer, and there's both written evidence of that and also archaeological evidence. Persimmon seeds are the third most common type of floral remain, meaning plant remnant, that was found in the House for Families dig here at Mount Vernon. So those are some of the foods that would have been available at Christmas. We really don't have records of specific traditions, kind of like the Christmas pie that the Washingtons would have been eating. So, in summary, winter would actually have been surprisingly varied and filling. We know that was more the case for the Washington family than for the enslaved. And there were some special holiday treats that were available this time of year that weren't available other times. So I hope that you've enjoyed this brief talk, and I hope that you'll join us for the next one. So long.